This is Mrs. Frederick Niven reading from Colour in the Canadian Rockies by Frederick Niven, and written when he was living in Willow Point near Nelson. There are two national parks regarding which I must tell something in this book, though they are not much smaller in content than the ones already visited. One is Mount Revelstoke Park and the other Kokanee Glacier Park. Kokanee Glacier Park is in southern British Columbia, no larger as the crow flies or in an airline than 10 miles by 10. Within its boundary is the glacier, Kokanee, the Dale Wheeler wrote of as the most southerly of the Selkirk system. There are no professional guides to this park and too few visitors to support one. I once led within its borders a guide from the main Rockies, and he could not cease from exclaiming that there was hardly any feed for horses. Open parklands such as he knew among the slopes of the Rockies and on the Selkirks are not to be found here. The greater rainfall is conducive instead to a growth of dense underbrush. This park may be entered by car from the charming little city of Nelson on the west arm of Kokanee Lake, or again by car from Caslow on the main lake, a mining town where one may sometimes read the announcement on the closed door of a store, "Shut for the day, gone fishing." A scenic road round the lake shore connects Nelson and Caslow, and there has been talk for some time of continuing a road between the one that climbs from Caslow and the end of the one from the west arm of Kokanee Lake, so that visitors may drive their cars in the summer months into the high passes. But the existent roads that I have mentioned are but old ones leading to mines, not to the glacier. Where they end, one must be his own pack horse, shoulder his load, and bear the burden and heat of the day for the sake of what Kokanee Glacier Park offers. From Whitehorse and Dawson in Yukon Territory to the Sierras of California, there are uncounted grand nooks of terrain known to few apart from those who live in their vicinity, and Kokanee Glacier Park is one of these. For some years I lived close to it. I would not say within easy access of it, because of the lack of roads, and because the trails in these parts require frequent attention to prevent old nature claiming them again. But within reasonably close access I lived a while, and when fate took me from the names of the creeks and the peaks, they had for me the quality of ballad music. Kokanee Creek, Nilsick Creek, Lemon Creek, Sitcom Creek, Coffee Creek, the Glory Basin, the Crazy Jane Basin, Esmeralda Peak, and the Lone Dutchman Trail. Some way up the creek known as Kokanee, which flows into the west arm of Kokanee Lake, there used to be a board tacked to a tree and pointing toward a jumble of hogbacks with crests and slopes tight packed with forest. On that board were the words "To the Lone Dutchman." The board is gone now, and the Lone Dutchman is gone too. In the high country of the region now constituted Kokanee Glacier Park, the Lone Dutchman followed his lonely calling. Often I have thought of him when visiting the lofty scenes of his solitary searchings and labours. One of his cabins at least still stands high above timber. He came to my mind one night of which I must tell, or one morning, perhaps I should say, for the hour was 1 a.m. I had climbed to a mine 1,000 feet above the last tapering spruce trees and had an invitation to stay the night. There was a vacant bunk for me, but I was too leg-weary to sleep. I rested an hour or two, wide awake, thinking of what I had seen during the day, of tall tamaracks and cedar groves, dusky and quiet, and western lilies by the roadsides and trail sides, and of the purple pen stamens for none but such chance pilgrim as myself to see. As I lay there, the moon looked in and swept curves of gold over the rounded timbers of the place, lying rectangular slabs of light on the square-cut ones, and slowly thrusting a shaft across the floor where mice ran. I rose and dressed and slipped outside. 12:30. I could read my watch with ease. In a lake that lay 1,000 feet below, I could see the still reflection of the spire-like trees that stood as in tranced stillness round it. Wedges of snow in the high clefts were golden in that light. There was an effect of eternal imperturbability on the mountains. Range after range I could see in that magical night, and over them here and there were dominating individual and lonely projections into radiant space. One I recall bulky and high-shouldered, too pyramidical, very majestic, slashed with moonlight and shadow. These rocky uplands then seemed kin with the mountains of the moon, all so still, so quiet. A thought of the lone Dutchman came into my head as I stood there. A few stories of him survived to give us an impression of the man. Square set and sturdy build, he had a stoop somewhat like a scholar's, from packing heavy loads on his back up precipitous places. He had a cabin in the Glory Basin, and when any visitors climbed so high, he would never allow them to partake of their own food, though all he had carried up on his back. He was the host. If they were hunters, he had one plea. Would they abstain from shooting goats on the rocks nearby, please? For he was taming them, a sort of Robinson Crusoe of the high country. There are prospectors and prospectors. There are mining men and mining men. Some there are who see more than the rocks among which they pry for colour or for ore bodies. They see the flowers, like our friend at the compressor. They extol the outlook from their camp, and tell one that the weariness of the climb is repaid by it alone. They watch the wild animals who share the land with them, from chipmunks to bears. Others there are to whom the forest and the mountains are hell. The golden rain of tamarack needles in September is to them only a sign that soon snow will come to interfere with their search. They never see the stars at night. I have met men of that type, bearded to the waist, their long locks unkempt, their voices high and querulous. Such are, however, of a type that is passing. Those who climbed to the lone Dutchman's cabin never found him talking to himself or in grievous altercation with an imagined other person. The glacier of Kokanee is no doubt the chief attraction of the park to most. The usual way of approach is from Nelson by car along the west arm of Kootenai Lake to where Kokanee Creek flows into it, and thence up a road that mounts about 6,000 feet in 12 miles and ends, or ended when I last saw it there, beside some tumble-down houses, bunkhouses, and the usual decaying concentration building and compressor house that one comes upon where mining activities have ceased or have been suspended for some time, long enough for the rank growths of summer and winter snows on the roofs to have taken charge. There are ore bodies still in that range of glittering silver lead, and it is possible, if market prices are happy for mining men, that the scene is changed now, that the wreckage has been cleared away and new houses with unbroken window panes stand there. I write of the place as I saw it on my last expedition. From deserted Pike City in the Ackling country to the forsaken mining camps of Colorado and Nevada, such places are often seen, deserted camps. The woods are full of them. The trestled towers of ancient gravity trams, somewhat after the style of a teleferica, guide the eye to the mine, several thousand feet higher and reached by trail. The mine buildings crouch on a high shelf under a strong snow shed. Without that snow shed, they would be swept down into the valley, where the avalanches descend from the barren, steep slopes above. The miners, sitting in their bunkhouse over a meal, grow accustomed when the thaws come to the rush overhead, the snow slide, and the darkening of the room. But accustomed though they were to that, not at all blasé to the sight of an avalanche, and after that hiss and darkening, they would leap to their feet and run to the windows to watch it charge down below them into the valley. Over slopes of scree behind the mine is the usual way of approach to the glacier. Over those scree slopes to a slit in the ultimate ridge, a crack, boulder-strewn and often, even in midsummer, with snow lingering in it. Those who have seen the Columbia ice fields or the glaciers of Wapatink Range in the Yoho Park will find Kokanee small, no doubt, but it has its grandeur as you view it from emerging at the top of that crack or tilted chimney. Curving from the crack is called the Battleship and the Giant's Kneecap, down toward the moraines at the head of Coffee Creek. In a wild meadow below it, I camped one night on a small and not too humid hillock, around the base of which the seepage was gurgling into runnels, and eager little rivulets that seemed in a hurry to find a way down. There I lay a long while before sleep came in a night that could not be called dark. Many people, I have discovered, believe that the northern lights, aurora borealis, are purely a winter phenomenon, but after hot summer days they frequently make displays, magnificent displays. There was no such display that night, but somewhere north they may have been active, for the sky in that direction held a vague radiance long after sunset, and the glacier reflected it wanly. Then a fragment of moon showed and played tricks with Kokanee Glacier. It seemed to be incandescent or lit by internal fires. Drowsing off, I was awakened by noises other than that of the tinkling of these rivulets. The glacier groaned, the glacier mumbled like a disturbed giant. Half awake, half asleep, I was aware of its recurrent icy sighs and moans. Kokanee Glacier, I should say, occupies only a small space in a relatively small park. There are the Woodbury Glaciers also, a little way northward and to east of the Sawtooth Range, within its borders. Caribou Glacier, Blue Grass Basin, Bear Grass Basin, White Heather Ridge. These are some appealing names in this little, relatively little, park. Down in the sophisticated valleys, one complained to me not long since of being dreadfully bored, and I suggested as a cure a visit to the high country. I received promptly a reply, "Oh, I've been there. I went there once." Sounded to me like, what shall we give her for her birthday? Oh, give her a book. She has a book. It takes all sorts in the ancient adage to make a world. For some of us to be in such places once is only a beginning. They have us enthralled till our hearts fail. Then we have our memories of them. This is Mrs. Frederick Niven reading from Canada West, written by Frederick Niven in Willow Point near Nelson. Mining has a place in the history of Canada. In the years 1859 and 60, wandering prospectors already in the Caribou country had found placer gold in such quantities as to create what was known as the Caribou Rush. Old California 49ers hurried northward, some travelling all the way overland, others arriving on coastal vessels at New Westminster to continue on their way along the banks of the Fraser, where to this day you can trace in many places the rut of their passage, the original Caribou Trail. Others came from the eastern states, from eastern Canada, from Britain, these trekking all the way across the prairies, passing into the Caribou country chiefly through the Yellowhead Pass. There were also, after the American Civil War, bodies of restless ex-soldiers roaming in the province looking for fortune in gold. They passed into the Columbia Valley, washing for gold dust at Wild Horse Creek, and continuing northwards as far as the Big Bend. Very little seems to have been recorded of these men, but I have met miners who have come upon sluice boxes, dovetailed and fitted together without use of any nails, in places where there is no record of there having ever been any prospecting, probably the work of these wanderers. The Caribou Rush is one of the greatest gold excitements in the history of placer mining. Of the Caribou Road, to the building of which there came from Britain by request of the colony of those days a company of Royal Engineers, you may read in any volume of history dealing with the province. But for an understanding of the present conditions of mining, I think one need go back no farther than 30 to 40 years, when the prospectors for precious ore were prying everywhere throughout the land. There were among these many alert, self-sufficient young men from the colleges specializing in mineralogical and geological courses. But more numerous than these were men whose college had been just the rocks themselves, or talks with their fellows in the hotel sitting rooms of the last frontier towns, heads together, passing one to another hunks of stone which they fished from their pockets. I wonder why most of these men seemed very old. Perhaps it was as much because many of them did not shave when out in the woods as because I was very young then. My own youthful wanderings in the province were of no commercial importance. I was not looking for gold or silver. I was just looking at the land. And a rolling stone gathers no moss, but it may get the corners chipped off and even achieve some sort of polish. So another wanderer, the province was full of them, told me that I once voiced a doubt regarding the wisdom of our roving experience. Always in that wandering there were these prospectors. They were everywhere. They have impressed themselves on my memory as men sufficient to themselves. I don't mean bombastic egoists, anything but that. Quiet men who face the music alone to impress themselves on one's memory. Exceptions were those among their number who were great talkers when in town. Usually they just sat resting in the armchairs in the windows of hotels of these diminutive mountain cities, looking straight before them, hardly twiddling a thumb, rising only at the sound of the dinner bell and, the meal over, returning to rest in their chairs again. I remember a remark from one of these. A row of us sat upon a veranda, while the mosquito hawks veered overhead as they do before twilight, most of us young and full of spirits. There was talk and laughter. Beside me an old man sat seemingly heedless. That others laughed did not make him laugh. Only when something really witty was said, a couple of chuckles in his chest announced that he was not so far from us as he might seem. The dark fell. and in place of a visible world of immensity we had only the tom-tomming of a creek, an everlasting sound beyond the dotted lights of that city. Then, before us very high, a portion of the sky seemed to take fire, became incandescent, and as we watched that glow, the rolling of the world brought up a full moon. The ridge-top trees were each clearly stamped upon its disk, and the banter of the young men slackened. They expressed their appreciation in such comments as "gosh" or "sun moon," and then one of them said it must be queer up there in the woods on a night like this. Then the old prospector made a remark. "Yes, sir," he said, "a man thinks powerful up there." That seemed to be all. "Nights like this," he ended. And then he rose and left us. I looked for him next day, but he was gone, back into the mountains on the quest for mineral, and unless I am greatly mistaken, drawn also by a lure of more than mineral. They were everywhere then. I remember going down the Arrow Lakes 32 years ago or so on the stern wheeler. Few of the wharfs or jetties that now thrust out into these lakes were in existence then, but up in the pilot house the skipper kept a watch upon the shore. Onto one of the beaches walked a man and waved a towel. To let him know he had been seen, the skipper responded with a blast of the siren. Echoes of its roar came dropping down to us from high gulches above timberline, and as these were falling the man on the beach looked back and up as if the echoes might be visible. The shallow draught stern wheeler pushed its nose into the sand, the cleated gangplank was thrust out, and he climbed on board, his pack sack slung upon his shoulder, in one hand the inevitable prospector short pick, and in the other a bulging sack of that tough canvas that is used for carrying ore specimens. They were everywhere, sometimes picking up the rocks for floats, that is to say fragments of ore carried down in rock slides, or under spring avalanches or in creeks, and, a float found, they would work upward, seeking for another that might lead them to the mother lode. Or they would try a creek for colour, shovelling sand into a pan, swirling it round with a practised motion. This they would do even on creeks that did not promise any great quantity of placer gold, but if any gold was there, it had come from somewhere. They were getting warm. We numbered in their ranks a good many cousin Jacks, old Cornish miners, with this mania in their blood for unearthing rich mineral. Some of them, in a word, were queer. I recall meeting one such on a rather lugubrious trail of the boundary country, Kettle Valley way. These were dark trees, and it was a dark forest. I was trudging uphill, pack on back, head bent, and it was the click of a hoof on a stone that caused me to raise my head. There, coming down towards me, beard upon chest, his steely eyes peering at me under the brim of his hat, was one of the breed, and behind him, head lowered, fumbling away down, came his pack horse like a dog at heel, laden with stereotyped grey blankets and the grub. To one side of the saddle protruded an axe, and a prospector's pick thrust under the rope to the other, and to the other a Winchester rifle, and flat, centred on top, was the pan. Walter Nixon of the Windermere, by the way, talking of these old fellows in camp one day, remarked that some of them were great on packing horses. It was one of them old fellows, he told me, just when he was leaving camp, came on a spoon and a fork that he hadn't packed. So he tucked the fork in on one side of the horse and ran round the other side to put the spoon there, so as to keep the load well balanced, just right. Well, be that as it may, and to return to this old man. He stopped abruptly, almost too abruptly for the horse, his broad forehead bumping him in the small of the back. He leant against it, eyeing me, and then he squatted down by the trail side. "How do?" he said. "How do you do?" I said. He made a grave inclination to the other side of the trail, as though there were a chair there for me. So dropping my blanket roll, I sat down on it, and we had a conversation, a curious conversation. He asked me a question, with apparent friendly interest about myself, and when I began to reply, his gaze was for way off in distance, the steely look gone out of his eyes and a haze there. He interrupted me to ask, "Have you heard from anybody if there's anything in this room of gold in the Similkameen?" I told him I had met one or two going thither, but the sharp gaze passed. He looked vaguely away, informed me I was a young man, and asked me what was taking me through the country. But again I had hardly begun to reply when sharply he spoke. "There was a man telling me," said he, "that he'd heard of somebody up in the Lardo making a strike. Have you heard anything of the Lardo?" I had heard nothing of the Lardo then, and said so, at which he averted his head and stared at the side of the trail as though I disappointed him, or as though he wondered what my interest in life might be anyhow. Then he rose, said he guessed he'd better be stepping, turned round and looked at his horse, which was pulling some odd tufts of grass, and informed it also that he guessed they'd better be stepping. He told me over his shoulder for a valedictory remark that it was nice to have a talk with somebody on the trail once in a while, wished me good luck, and trudged on, his pack horse at heel, one of a type still lingering here and no more. This is Mrs. Frederick Niven reading a chapter from Mine Inheritance by Frederick Niven, written at Willow Point near Nelson. It begins with the inquiry for buffalo meat. The half-breeds at Pembina we had found friendly on our visits. They seemed eager to provide buffalo meat during the winter for the settlers, and their terms were not unreasonable. So it was that with a convoy of Indians the party for Pembina set out, and it was on that journey events occurred which served as a nucleus for stories to be spread in Scotland regarding the terrorisation of the Selkirk settlers. The journey was undertaken in rough carts, those two-wheeled carts made by the half-breeds of the neighbourhood without aid of any nail, without iron in any part, the Red River carts. On the second day the caravan was strung out in the long line across the prairie. Despite the superficial aspect of flatness there, undulations existed. Carts far in advance disappeared, sank from sight, appeared again, and the sound of their passage was deafening, a high, shrill squeal as the wooden axles revolved. Pembina, a Northwest Company fort, a collection of log cabins, leather teepees, bark wigwams, 60 miles south of the confluence of the Assiniboine and Red Rivers. There, under the direction of John MacLeod, with whom I had made friends on the sea voyage, a post for the Hudson's Bay Company had been built called Fort Dare, and at the same time more cabins, these to shelter the settlers close to the buffaloes' winter grounds. Some had no windows. Some had windows of parchment, pieces of skin scraped amazingly fine and stretched across the spaces left for them. When it was raining, or when there was moisture in the air, they relaxed somewhat, and on dry days tautened. Occasionally, when the sun had been warm on the outside, or the stove hot within, the parchment would emit a small ting. MacLeod and his party had worked well. I know that Captain MacDonnell would have rejoiced to have him in the colony service, but he was a company officer, and soon after the installing of the settlers who were to winter there, he went off, by orders of Heaney, with another Hudson's Bay man. I was glad that Mr. Spencer had been given the position of Assistant Governor. Often when we were alone, the Governor would relax, suspend his authoritative manner, and at the back of his mind all the time was anxiety regarding the supplies for his people, supply of that staple of pemmican. Not only those he brought here to Pembina, close to the hunting grounds, had to be considered, but those at the forks. These Metis, he said, seemed to him too carefree. On the fringes of the village were teepees of Indians, and thud, 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 thud went the drums out there, night after night. Always they were dancing. In Pembina itself the fiddles of the half-breeds were playing, accompanied by other drums, but the full-bloods had not adopted the violin. The half-breeds retained the tom-tom. It was by Captain MacDonnell's desire that I went further into this world. He explained the situation to all of us, though to be sure few of us needed explanation. We must have buffalo meat, he said. It's absolutely essential. I have no right to demand of any of you young men who are engaged as labourers or writers to do such work as buffalo hunting, and I should like as many as possible to go out with these half-breeds to the hunt. I simply ask for volunteers. So it was that some days later I rode out of Pembina with a party going westwards to the buffalo hunting. A young Metis of about my own age, or a year or two older, whom I knew, but by the name of Jules, had attached himself to me in a manner that seemed at one and the same time friendly and contemptuous. He would learn me this and that and the other, he said. Miles MacDonnell had arranged for all those who volunteered to go a-hunting to have horses. Jules gave me his bridle, explaining that he was so fine a horseman he did not need one. Some day, possibly, he suggested, I might be able to ride as he did, with merely a piece of rawhide looped round the horse's lower jaw. Actually, the manner of that looping, as a matter of fact, made it as effective as a cruel curb, and the bit he gave me was but as an ordinary snaffle. There were moments when I swithered between gratitude and annoyance. We moved off on the prairies to the coteau, young men on horseback, women also on horseback, but with tepee poles affixed on each side of their mount and dragging on the ground behind. On shorter poles laid across these were the rolls of tenting, the pots and kettles, poles laid across called the travois. We had some Red River carts with us. I thought that these made noise sufficient to drive all the buffalo out of the country. Yet ever and again the scouts ahead singled that they had espied a herd, and a column would halt, and away we went in chase. Not once during the first 2 or 3 days did I get a shot. The small groups, small herds we sighted were quickly slaughtered without my aid. The women made up on the hunters, half-breed wives and their daughters, and those women from whom the settlers who had volunteered to accompany them and learn, to be learned, as the half-French Jules would say, how to gallop these beasts. Their fires at night they made of dried buffalo chips, with which the plains were strewn. Then came a day when, out of the northward space, went lumbering right across our path a great herd. The carts and travois abruptly stopped, and we rode ahead. It soon became clear, because of the speed at which the buffalo moved, that they were being pursued. There was herd panic there. On that occasion I succeeded in getting within acting distance. Here, I realized, was a dangerous employ. Had the beasts been scattered out, it would have been otherwise, but they were already mobbed close. With the sudden arrival of these enemies on their flank, they crowded each against other closer, still in attempt to veer westward. I recalled instructions regarding where to shoot, beside the shoulder, so that a shot would penetrate the heart. My aim was true, though less might it be called aim than a mere thrusting of my piece against the animal I chose. Down went the great bull upon his 4 knees, bowed on his head and succumbed. I was not expert enough to reload with my horse at the gallop, and found myself unable to slacken its pace. In attempts to reload I but spilt powder. I had killed a buffalo, 1 buffalo. I would kill no more. But my horse was accustomed to the game, and it was obvious it was trying to keep level with another buffalo. The beasts, with their heavily furred foreparts and smooth hinder parts, were soon all round me, and their distracting lowing and bellowing was loud. I tried again to ride without rein, with but balance and leg hold, and to reload my musket, but again in vain. Then past me in the billowing dust went Jules. "Watch me," he shouted as he went by, "like this. I'll learn you. Keep your bullets in your mouth." Suddenly his horse fell, and he went over his head. A second later, out of the dust cloud came a scream of agony. I tried to rein in, but could not. My horse had his neck craned, his head up. The horn of a frantic cow to left grazed my thigh, while the shrill bellowing rose on all sides, and the smell of the herd was pungent in my nostrils. Grit was in my eyes and throat. A veritable Indian rode past me, another surged by. Both were armed with bows and arrows, and I saw a forearm thrust out, an elbow drawn back, heard the twang of the release. As the buffalo fell, the hunter's lean horse swung sidewise to avoid falling over it. For a moment the man's leg rubbed against mine, his pony's croup crushed my calf. In that whirl of dust my horse was at last less anxious to continue. It was beginning to be blown with the chase and the excitement, and of its own will it slackened speed, loped, walked, permitted itself to be halted, and in answer to a slap on the neck, wheeled. The plain was strewn with buffalo. By these Indians who had overtaken me, I decided that the herd we had come upon had been started on its flight by a hunting party of full-bloods, and I wondered if they would consider that the half-breeds and we had no right to join the hunt. But Jules' scream was still as it were in my ears. What had happened to him? Where was he? When he fell, the herd was dense, the beasts packed close in flight. As I turned back to look for him, a riderless horse ran across the plain with the quick drumming rub-a-dub of a horse in panic. But it was not Jules, and I began to speculate on how many accidents or fatalities there had been in that chase. Through the falling dust I saw a group of men. There were several riders clustered together, both Metis and Indians, but clearly not in a quarrel of any kind. One dismounted, then another. I drew closer. There lay Jules. There lay Jules, crumpled, trampled, and torn. One of those bending over him came erect, and looking round saw me. In the act of dismounting I immediately recognized him. That was Kokanee. Yes, that was the man so introduced by John Willis at Fort Gibraltar. Kokanee, said Willis, a free trader, known by no other name on the prairies and desiring no other name. Kokanee also recognized me. So there you are, Baxter, he said. Ha! Well, Baxter. He repeated the name oddly. It seemed to me there was a note of derision in his way of saying it. Well, Baxter, this is different from Renfrewshire, hey? I had nothing to say. There lay Jules' body, the blood in a thick pool beside it. The Indians who had been looking on flicked their moccasins' heels against the flanks of their horses and rode away. The incident evidently closed for them. But the two half-breeds who remained were young, and by reason of their youth, and of Kokanee's superior years as well as his colour, they awaited his instructions. From a swift, dissatisfied examination of them, he turned to me. "These things have to be attended to," said he. "Are the people you were with far back?" "They cannot be," I replied. "We saw the herd closing just ahead of us." "Well, they will not want to bury him here. You will have to help me to lift him, David." He took the reins out of my hand and knotted them up to the tail of his own horse. "Come along, lend a hand before he stiffens." As we lifted the body, the head rolled back and the eyes opened, and for a moment I thought Jules was alive. But his eyes were glassy, the spirit had gone out of them. We laid him across Kokanee's saddle. "Do you steady him," he cautioned, "while I walk in front." At my momentary hesitancy he gave me a backward frown of disapproval. Then ahead he trudged, leading his horse, with uneven steps over the uneven ground. He went towards a ridge where some rocks showed, while I walked behind with one hand on the body to steady it. "I can hear the squeal of their carts pretty near," he said over his shoulder to me, and then, "Here they come." Over a rise of the prairie came the Red River carts with the women. "Are any of the corpses' family with them?" asked Kokanee. "His mother," I replied. "Well, you go and tell her." "What have I to say?" I inquired at a loss. Kokanee frowned and tossed his head to one side as a man might do when evading the lunge of a wasp. "Tell her, that's all. Tell her. These things happen. That is life. Tell her, for God's sake, what can you tell her, but that her son is dead?" I left him and hurried on to meet the carts, and in one of the first the mother sat driving. She may not have been as old as she looked, but to me she seemed then very old. "What's wrong?" she asked, with puckering eyes looking beyond me. With tentative expression she considered what she saw. A big white man trudging beside a horse over the back of which a body lay, and a led horse behind. Her eyes narrowed. "That Jules?" she inquired. I could only nod my head at first, then, "Yes," I said with difficulty. "He dead?" she asked. I inclined my head again. Slowly she climbed over the cart's rail to the hub and came to the ground, and with a tottering in her gait hurried to meet Kokanee. I followed her. She stood beside the horse, put one hand up, felt the body, stroked the face, and tears coursed down her cheeks. "Plenty stone here," she muttered. "The wolves will not get him here." By that time some of the young men who had been far in pursuit of the buffalo and unaware of what had happened were returning. Several of them came riding at the gallop in a race to see which would be back first at the carts, and emitting sharp yells as they rode. But others, The two who had been with the body when I found it amongst them called to them warningly. They reined in. They looked left and right, questioning. Then they saw that group, the horse with the body lying over the saddle, the led horse, the massive Kokanee, the old woman, very small, beside him. I heard them talking quietly. "Who is it?" asked one. "Jules." "I thought Jules," said another. "Well, what does he say?" said the first. "Jules Mengauche." This was the first time I'd heard him called by his name in full. "So, that is his mother then?" "As I thought when we rode up," said the first speaker. "Well, what happened?" "He fell." "How?" "I do not know." "Well, who is it?" asked another. Jules Mengauche." "Dead?" "Yes." Kokanee turned to them, spoke for the woman, called to them. "She says there are a lot of stones here to keep the wolves away. You could make a grave." They looked one to another. They had the manner of each wishing that the other would do the work, though no arduous work it was, as I was to see. They scraped away a hollow, or rather they enlarged a hollow, a natural hollow, already there on the crest of the ridge. They slit the turf with their knives in the same manner as when gathering sods for the roofs of their houses. Then with their hands they dug like badgers, and made their hollow a little deeper. Their ancestors upon one side did not believe in putting the dead in the earth, wrapped them in deer skins and raised them up in the branches of trees, or elevated them on scaffoldings over the prairie in lonely places. Most of them probably shared the doubt of full-blood Indians regarding interment, a doubt that the spirit would escape. But to assist in that escape, a shallow grave was desirable. The body was placed in the grave. The earth was kicked over it. Diffits were docked on the top. And then they moved to and fro, gathering stones, and without exchange of a word piled them over that shallow grave. Click, click, click went the stones against each other. Click, 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 while the mother stood apart, sobbing. The others seemed more embarrassed than grieved. Here was something that humanly had to be attended to on her half, and at last they whispered among each other. Some said, "Oh, enough." Others said, "Oh, put some more." The first stones had been laid more or less circumspectly on the covering sods, but the final ones were tossed there. They turned away. The sun had set, and immediately that it was set below the horizon, a thin wind that was blowing set me shaking with cold. "You'd better come over with me," said Kokanee, "and I'll give you something to stop the tremor." I had the inclination to reply that I would remain with those from Pembina, but Kokanee read the refusal on my face. "My camp is already made," he said. So I mounted, and we rode side by side over the rolling land. The sky still reflected the light of the sun. Westward were flecks of cloud from north to south, poised in space, their undersides as though molten, and in the air was a suffusion of radiance. The horses' hoofs, as they passed through any slight indentation, trampled through twilight in the grass, and I had the feeling of sitting very high in the sunset glory. It was the exquisite hour, the melancholy hour, with its obvious hint of passing time, and on that wind was more than a suggestion of winter. This reading was taken from Mine Inheritance by Frederick Niven, which was founded on the story of the Red River settlement and the trials and triumphs of the Scottish settlers who, under the auspices of Lord Selkirk in 1811, came to what is now Manitoba and was in those days known as Assiniboia.